Hey guys, here it is, our third class, and probably the biggest and most important class, plot, which is all about getting your story moving and getting your characters to doing something. So let's get started. So plot, what is it? So really simply, at a simplistic level, plot is a progression of your story from one point to the next. It's really kind of how your characters move through the story. So if your characters are game pieces and the setting is a game board, plot would be how you move your pieces across that game board. And really, plot is not an idea, it's how an idea plays out. You'll hear this a lot within the writing community that you can't copyright ideas. You can only copyright the execution of those ideas. So for example, if I give you the idea, new girl in town falls in love with a vampire, that could be a lot of different stories. It could be Twilight, it could be Vampire Diaries, there's tons of different stories that, play out with that. So you can't really copyright an idea, which is, I think, a problem a lot of new writers have, because they have a great idea and then they see something similar gets sold and they get very discouraged. But the reality is that there are a lot of stories out there that sound the same because the idea is the same, but the execution and how the plot rolls out is very, very different. So in this class, we're going to talk about the 8-step plot format. And this is a format created by Nigel Watts. He wrote a book about getting published. And it's really the 8 major events that constitute your plot. Now, there are a lot of different ways of looking at plot. There's a 6-step plot. There's a 3-act format, which is popular with screenplays. There's, what we call Save the Cat. If you look up how to write a book, you'll find just as many different ways of looking at plot as you will, people telling you how to write a book. For me, I find the 8-step plot format useful because it's really easy. It's great for revisions, and it's good for in-progress works. And I am not an outliner. So for me, to be able to know that I'm hitting these 8 steps and these 8 points as I'm free writing through the story the first time, and then to be able to apply these 8 steps when I go back through, it works really well for me. So again, one way may not work for everybody else. So if you use this and you don't find it helpful and you're very confused about how it works, definitely look at some of the different options. 6-step plot, the 3-act, and then Save the Cat are probably the other 3 that I would recommend people look at, especially when you're starting out with writing. So here's our 8 steps. You can see every story has these 8 steps. So you have the stasis, the trigger, the quest, surprise, critical choice, climax, reversal, resolution. Any book you read, whether it's fiction, whether it's a fiction like a contemporary fiction or it's genre fiction like fantasy or sci-fi, they all are going to have these 8 steps. You can apply this to movies. You can apply this to plays. Every story that is a complete story will have these 8 steps. And if you're missing one of these steps, that's where you start to run into problems. So the first step is stasis, and this is the beginning of the story. This is your characters, sitting around eating breakfast with the family before they go off to school. This is stasis. This is just kind of your ho-hum everyday life. Examples of stasis in popular works is Katniss Katniss hunting with Gale before the reaping, on the reaping day, and Tris eating dinner with her family the night before on choosing day, where we get to see these characters, this is their lives as we come in. They're very boring. It's usually very, not very exciting. Just kind of this average, Joe life. If you're, Harry Potter, this is him living underneath the staircase. If you're Bella, this is her moving into town with her dad. I mean, this is everybody has a stasis, and it's the kind of the first couple pages that we kind of tend to really try to skim through. And then we have the trigger. And the trigger is really that, that inciting incident. It's what sets your character in motion in the story. Now, the important thing about the trigger is it should be something that happens that is beyond the main character's control. If this isn't the main character deciding to go to, London for study abroad, this is, the main character deciding to go to London for study abroad and then the plane crashing. So, your trigger is the event that initiates a story. Sometimes people will start their story with the trigger and will kind of almost skip that stasis, and that's fine. You should start your story as close to the trigger as possible that makes sense for your story. So if your story is a dystopian, if it's science fiction, if it's high fantasy, you're going to have a little more stasis before you have that trigger because you need to introduce people to your world. If your story is a contemporary fiction, you're probably only going to have 1 or 2 pages of your stasis before the trigger is introduced, and they might actually almost be simultaneously introduced. But the most important thing is that the trigger needs to be something that happens beyond the main character's control, because if the main character controls the trigger and creates it happening on purpose, then it's not really a trigger because they don't really have to respond to it in the same way. So, for examples of triggers are Prim's name being chosen during the reaping in Hunger Games, or Tris finding out that she's divergent during the testing, where she figures out that she's not like everybody else, because those events set the rest of the story in motion. So, every trigger results in the quest, and depending on the trigger, the quest can be a positive or it could be negative. So if the trigger is a positive trigger, for example, it's a family winning the lottery, the quest should be a relatively positive one. It should be, the family learning how to spend their money, the adjusting family dynamics in light of this windfall. If it's a negative one, then it's probably going to be, the quest is going to be something to change that negative outcome of that trigger. So, a positive example of a trigger is Tris finding out she's divergent gives her the courage to pick Dauntless, and that kind of sets her on her path to becoming Dauntless instead of abnegation. And a negative example is Prim during the reaping causes Katniss to volunteer as tribute, sending her on a quest to survive the games. Now, a positive quest can end up being a negative one, and a negative quest can end up being a positive one. It's just it doesn't really change your character's perspective on having to do the quest. Well, I take that back. It changes the character's perspective on having to do the quest. So, for example, Tris is very excited to go and join Dauntless. She has some reservations, and she's really, excited to this new life that she's chosen for herself. Whereas Katniss is not excited about doing the games because she thinks she's going to die. So, and in the end, both of those things, Tris becoming Dauntless becomes a negative thing for her because, there's all this upheaval in this war after the fact. And then Katniss actually ends up becoming this hero. So, even though her quest is very negative and full of hardship, her final outcome is positive. And once the quest is initiated, you're going to embark on what we call the surprise. And this is the bulk of the story, and this is what we usually call the soggy middle if you have problems with your middle of your story. If you're using a 3-act story, this would be all of Act 2. And the surprise consists of your events and obstacles between the main character and the goal of their quest. These are happy events, they're sad events, and what should happen is each of these events within the surprise should end up being kind of these mini 8-step plots. So you'll have, each of these little events will have, a trigger, a quest, a surprise, etc. It's a lot easier to see this when you're writing, because if you have a scene that's not working, all you have to do is look for those 8 steps, and if you missed a step, that's usually why the scene doesn't work. And an example of the surprise is Tris in her time in Dauntless, up until, the final battle, and Katniss in the Capitol, and then at the games. This is just really the events of your story. And these should be high stakes. Like these should start out as, as you go through the story, the surprise should, become harder, and each event within the surprise should have higher stakes and, more dire consequences. So, for example, if you're writing a story about someone recovering from grief, maybe the first event in the surprise is, they're kind of, they alienate their best friend, and then the next story, the part of the surprise is, now their boyfriend is kind of thinking that they're not there and they're not responding to them. So it should just like there should be higher and higher consequences. The last event of the surprise is the character, either tries to commit suicide, or the character has a falling out with their family. Just like so, these things get progressively worse, or progressively harder for the main character. If your surprise consists of 5 very milquetoast events, that's a very soggy middle, and there's going to be no rising action for your plot. And then at the end of the surprise is the critical choice. And this really is the scene that will begin the events of the climax. And this is a crucial decision that reveals not only who your character is, but should be also in line with what you've shown your reader in the earlier passages. So for example, if your character is very meek, this should be the point at which they decide to either, no longer become meek, or they fail to make a critical choice because they are meek. This should be kind of like the turning point for your character, and this is also going to be the turning point for your story. So, for example, this is Triss getting on the train to try and stop the killing of Abnegation because, she's up to this point, she's been kind of, a pretty selfish character, and she's not very, not very good at, trying to do the right thing necessarily. And then, this kind of goes on to, her end up when she kills Will. And in Hunger Games, this is Katniss deciding to fight Cato. Katniss has just been kind of surviving the game up to this point. And then she takes care of Peeta, and then she realizes that, she has to end it. She has to become the aggressor. And so this is when her and Peeta decide to go, after Cato, because he's the only one left. So, this critical choice is going to, really impact how your climax rolls out. And you can think about what your character's critical choice is and see what happens if you go, with choice A, B, C, or D, and sometimes if your critical choice, the first critical choice doesn't work, you may want to back up to this point and rewrite to the end, because sometimes it's just, you forced your character to make a choice that doesn't really play in line with their character, which is, when we talk about the author imposing their own voice over the character's voice, this is, critical choice is usually a good place where we can see that. And then after the critical choice is a climax. And this is really the result of the choice, and it should be the point of the highest tension in your book. This is the scene that the entire story hinges upon. Failure means, complete failure of the quest, and success means your character has accomplished, what they needed to accomplish. And the climax doesn't have to be just one scene. I think a lot of times when you're talking about like elementary school and high school, your English teacher gives a climax as a high point of the story. But it can actually be several scenes. It doesn't have to necessarily just be one scene. It could be 3 or 4 chapters. And in Divergent, this is really the battle scenes, these battle scenes until, the end. And then in Hunger Games, it's the battle of Cato and the dog. So, it's a couple chapters in there. And one of the things about climax is people try to kind of throw too much into the climax. And what I mean by too much in the climax, they want to have, a big emotional scene between the hero and, the love interest. They want to have a big fight scene. They want to have a big, like, coming together family scene. And your climax should be mostly action, with your character responding just enough to bring the reader along. If you slow down the action too much in your climax, and this is regardless of whether this is, a dystopian, science fiction, contemporary, what happens is your climax will feel really drawn out, and people will wonder when the story is going to end. You hear this a lot of times where people are like, I thought the story was over, and then it kept going. So you have to be careful that, you ratchet up that tension just enough. And when your words on the page, you'll see it. You'll see if your climax is, if it has enough bang, or if it was just kind of just drawn out action. And so then we come to the reversal. And the reversal is really just the consequence of the critical choice and the outcome of the climax. And when the reversal is unexpected, this is what we call a twist. The thing about an unexpected reversal is it should still be predictable from earlier events. It's just that the character, your reader didn't see that the character would go that way. And the reversal could be a trigger for your sequel. So if you're writing a trilogy, your reversal would almost be the trigger for the next story, just to link that action together. And I think the reversal is, with the reversal, you have to kind of look at what the consequences are of your character's critical choice, and you have to know what the different options would be in your story. So if your character went with, choice A, what would your reversal look like? If they went with choice B, what would your reversal look like? This is a lot easier to kind of pick out in stories than it is to describe to people when they are writing the stories. So I apologize for that. But an example of a reversal is Triss's mom jumping in front of the bullet and their father helping her break into Donald's compound. Because from those characters, we know that Triss's mom is, selfless, and we know that her father loves her. So, these are things that we expect from their actions because of what we've seen the entire story. And then for the reversal for Katniss is pretending to eat the berries and raising President Snow's ire because, we know she's a little bit rebellious, and we also know she wants to survive, and she wants to, and, by this point in the story, we know that she has no respect for, the current government, and that she's willing to do anything. So, those reversals are very predictable. An unexpected reversal would be if you read anything in Gillian Flynn's books. Her reversals are always unexpected, and it's things that you could easily predict from earlier events in the story, but you never see coming. So, just a couple examples for reversals. If you're reading books, look for the reversal. Figure out where the climax is and figure out where the reversal happens, and then it'll be a little easier when you're writing your own stories to see how that should play out. And so then we come to the resolution, which is kind of like the happy ending part of the story. It's the aftermath. Everybody's changed. It can be the stasis for a new story, awaiting a new trigger. If you have a story where your reversal is the trigger for the next story, then you wouldn't necessarily have a resolution. The resolution would be kind of buried within your new quest. An example of the resolution is Tristan and Tobias head to the Amity compound, and for Katniss and Peeta, it's when they return to District 12. The thing about the resolution is, like every other scene, it should only be as long as it needs to be. Sometimes you see the resolution is 4 or 5 chapters long. People are like, it's the happy ending, and like then we find out they had kids, and then we find out they did this. You can do that at the end of a trilogy. That makes sense. But again, you want to just give just enough time to give your readers closure, to let them kind of like come down from the story and realize like everything's going to be okay, or everything's not going to be okay, depending on what kind of ending you write. But even an open-ended resolution is still a resolution. And so here's some ideas, some things to think about when you're actually working your scenes in your plot. Each of your scenes should contain each of those 8 steps. So what happens is your story ends up being a series of nested 8 steps in the overall plot of 8 steps. So for your trigger, you should have all of those little 8 steps. For during your quest, each scene should have each of those 8 steps. And if you have a scene that feels really flat, isn't flowing, doesn't working, check for your 8 steps. See where maybe you miss a step. Is there a trigger in the scene? Is there a stasis in the scene? Is there a reversal and a climax in the scene? And one of those ways you're going to really see your writing, kind of pick up is when you're looking for those 8 steps and making sure that they're in each scene. So here we are with our intersections. So our intersection of plot and character. And mostly it's going to deal with how your character reacts to the events of the plot. Any character is going to have a certain number of responses, right? If your character is a very aggressive character, running and hiding probably is not going to be their first choice. So, you have to, even though you might have the same exact plot as a friend, if you have different characters, how that plot rolls out is going to feel very different. And the trigger and the climax should be tailored to your character. They should set your main character's world in a way that feels very personal to them. So, for example, if there's a trigger and is someone dying, the trigger shouldn't be, someone's best friend's father dying, because that's upsetting, but not in a very, very personal way. But a best friend dying, or the main character's father dying, those are very personal, very close to you kind of moments. So just make sure that when you have these events happening, they're not too distant from your character, because if they're too distant from the character, it's going to feel a whole lot of so what as you're reading the story. And that's one of the things and then also make sure that your characters have enough time to respond to the events of the plot. If there's no response, I see this a lot of times when people are trying to write for like high tension, the character doesn't get a chance to respond. All these terrible things are happening, there's no chance to respond. We need to have that character response, because it's also a time for your reader to respond. And your reader needs those breather spaces. So just keep in mind when you're writing this that you have your character respond to these events in a way that feels natural to them. And an example is Tris witnesses both her parents die selflessly for when she's struggled to be selfless. So it feels really kind of like a personal dig to her. Here she is, who knows she's a person who knows she's not for abnegation, and then she sees her parents, who are very much that that group, being so very selfless, and it really sets up all of her actions for the later books. And then in the intersection of plot and setting, your setting should conform to your plot, and your plot should conform to your setting. So the events in your story, your plot should have settings that fit. If you have a space opera, and your setting is a spaceship, your plot points should reflect, decisions that would be natural to a spaceship. I think that's kind of common sense, but sometimes, you see, for example, this is, when you have the kissing and making out scene right in the middle of the battle scene. That doesn't really make sense. Aliens are landing and we're gonna run and hide in the barn and then make out. So like one of those things that, it should feel natural. If you've been fighting aliens all day and we finally got into a safe spot, and we're unwinding, and we have all these feelings, then maybe if it's the middle of a battle scene, you probably aren't going to want to have that happen. So just keep that in mind, that your plot and your setting and those events should make sense. No one's going to make out in the middle of a battlefield, or at least they shouldn't, because that's not smart. And then setting should also dictate and limit your character's available responses. So if you have a shootout in a wide open space with no cover, that's going to limit your character's options for response. Whereas if they're fighting in, a grocery store or in the middle of the woods, your character is going to have the option to duck down behind a tree and low crawl to the objective. So just keep in mind that all of your responses should fit. All your available responses within the plot should fit your setting. So you might want, if you have a story that takes place, like a contemporary story takes place in a very close-knit family, you want to make sure that those events, the important events, would happen at home, because we're a close-knit family. Or they might happen with one character away from home talking over the phone, where things get lost in translation. Just think about that as your events are unfolding for your plot, especially with during the quest portion of your plot, just because there's so much that should happen there, and if you're the same setting over and over and over, it's going to start to feel stale. So you really want to vary those settings to make sure that you vary the tension and the emotional response to the events. All right, so here we are at the end, and here's our exercises. Here one of the things you can do is take your trigger and make it exponentially worse. I think I misspelled that word. Make it exponentially worse for the main character. How does that change your quest? Now do the same with your climax. How does that impact your reversal? So, for example, if your trigger is your character gets a bad grade on a test, instead of your character being a bad grade on a test, how about your character gets kicked out of school? How about that's the events that unfurl? So then, your response, your main character's response to that trigger is going to be much different than a single bad grade. And really the trigger and the climax are where you should have, you know, some really high stakes. And if it doesn't feel like your story, you know, if you have a whole bunch of so what kind of going on in the story, like, you know, the reader's reading along and they're like, so what, who cares, then, you know, those are some places where you can make those adjustments and really like heighten the tension and heighten the stakes for your characters, so that you do have, you know, a lot of like, oh, this is happening for your reader, and a little less so what. And then look at a specific scene within your quest, because the quest is where we tend to the action tends to bog down and pacing slows, and books, you know, stories start to fall apart in that second act in the middle. You know, make it an 8-step plot point for a secondary character. How does that change your plot? So, you know, one of the things we should do is we should look at secondary characters and try to figure out what their 8-step process is within the story. We don't necessarily need to see all of their 8 steps in the story, but 1 or 2 of those steps happening in the story, you know, we can see their trigger happening through the eyes of their friend. You know what? Maybe their trigger is part of the quest. You know, that will change your story, and that will add some complexity to your secondary characters. So just some things to think about as you're writing. And that's all I had. Hey, I hope you guys got a lot out of these classes, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Have a great day.